Hello and welcome back. We're so thankful that you're here on another episode of You Are From God, the podcast where we open the Bible to discover the image of God in ourselves and the people around us. We're very thankful, as always, that you've decided to tune in here for our weekly Bible reading. We are in Proverbs 6 to start, to anchor ourselves in some godly wisdom to begin, and then we're going to jump back into the book of James. So, Scott, why don't you take it away with Proverbs?
Yeah, Proverbs 6 is really just a continuation of parents counseling a child here. You have a dad talking to his son, and he just really continues the conversation about actually living the life. If you're um, in situations where you have to make a choice, make sure that you're using the principles and the wisdom that he's been given, the knowledge he's been given, and apply it and make sure you're doing the things you need to do. But there's so many interesting verses that are found here. Verse 6 to me, go to the ant, O sluggard, observe her ways and be wise, which having no chief officer or ruler prepares her food in the summer and gathers her provisions in the harvest. And it continues on talking about this here, Tyler. But what I love about this part is when we see ants, you kind of just see, oh, there's an ant, and you keep walking or you watch them for a few minutes. I love that it talks about the observing piece. One of the things that I think so neat that we're blessed with in this world is God's creation, of course. But it's not simply just to say, oh, look how beautiful this is, which it is, but it's actually to learn from what's around us and to observe the things, and so many different things that we're able to find knowledge and able to continue to grow. And just using an ant will teach you not to be lazy, as he talks about here. And that's such an important lesson to learn for anybody, but certainly as obviously a dad teaching his son here as he's talking. He'll go on, obviously, and there's a lot of things that are talked about here. Verse 16 is the verse you'll hear pretty often about the six things the Lord hates, the seven which are the abomination. And he talks about some things here, and a lot of them are about the tongue that fall into that category, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. I do find it, as he goes on in verse 20, my son, observe the commandments of your father and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Bind them continually on your heart, tie them around your neck. And again, he continues talking about this. Understand the importance of this wisdom that we are getting, or this knowledge that we're getting, making sure that we're listening to the wisdom of those that have experienced through things, have grown through various things, and they're trying to teach us something. Sometimes young people, and we've all been in this situation, you kind of think that you know, and your parents don't know what they're talking about necessarily, and it's sad because there's principles that apply no matter the time, no matter the age, no matter the technology. There's certain principles that apply every time. And as he goes on here in verse 27, again, can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burnt? And the conversation around here is a lot of times we try to get as close as possible to things that we shouldn't be doing, or thinking it's not going to have an effect on us. And the reality is you can't take the fire in and expect it not to burn you. If you're going to associate and be around these things, there's going to be consequences to it, and there's going to be difficulties that come with those things. Again, he brings up the idea of the adulteress here and the harlot, and so you have a theme that continues throughout this part of the book of Proverbs. But for us, the bigger picture, as we get into especially the book of James, these are the things we need to see. It can't be that we're trying to walk down both avenues. We're striving to serve God or serve ourselves, and it can't be both. And that's the reality when it comes down to not just saying it, but actually living the life.
Yeah, I mean, Proverbs 6, you just have so much going on in this chapter, looking at what the son needs to do or wants to do. But ultimately, the whole point of a father passing along that wisdom is so that you don't have to go through these things and make the mistakes in order to learn from them. There's wisdom recorded and wisdom passed down so that we can avoid those pitfalls, so that we don't engage in these activities that end up hurting us and other people, and so that we can understand the good way and just start there and experience for ourselves, hey, this is good. And so to the parent-child conversation, sometimes it's, I'm teaching you this so that you don't hurt yourself, or you don't have to learn the hard way, as we would say it. And so you see that a lot in Proverbs. James, to me, is essentially the wisdom book of the New Testament. Right. Obviously, you talk about any of God's writing, and there's wisdom to be taken from it. But James is written in a very similar style, I would say, to the book of
Mhm.
Proverbs, in that there's going to be some very practical illustrations he uses, just like we saw with the ant in this last reading. But there's also just some very poignant pieces of how we interact with each other, the things that are going on inside of our hearts, and how to assess that and choose the wise, thoughtful way. The end of chapter 3 is actually going to spend a good deal of time talking about the two types of wisdom. There's wisdom from above, the heavenly wisdom that Proverbs is promoting, encouraging us to have. And then there's this earthly spirit, unspiritual, the demonic wisdom, as it'll call it there at the end. So that's really what's on the table as we're looking at James, and he's bringing this to bear from the new covenant in Christ. How does Christ teach us to walk in this wisdom? James chapter 2, where we're starting here, it's essentially that relationship piece that he looks at, this partiality that we have, and he spells it out. If you're together in a worship assembly and somebody comes in and they look really nicely dressed, you're going to treat them well, and somebody comes in and you can tell that they're poor by the way that they're dressed, and you're treating them as less than you. He says, you become judges with evil thoughts. That's there in verse 4. You have become judges with evil thoughts and making those distinctions. And so he makes it very clear God shows no partiality. We need to learn not to show partiality. That's really hard as humans because we are wired to make quick assessments, especially the longer we live and the more experiences we have. It's one of the ways that we kind of help understand the world around us. But we have to be able to tamper that and control that with a sense of seeing the image of God in other people. And that's something that James stresses here, whether it's how we're speaking to them, whether it's how we're treating them and interacting with them, as he talks about at the beginning of chapter 2. You've got to see the image of God. And when he gets into the tongue in chapter 3, that's one of the big building blocks of what he's teaching here. He'll talk about the tongue in verse 8 in particular. No human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. With it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so. Does a spring pour forth from the same opening both fresh and salt water? Can a fig tree, my brothers, bear olives, or a grapevine produce figs? Neither can a salt pond yield fresh water. There's a lot of those nature imagery things that make sense to us. We can observe and say that's neat, as you said. But there's something to learn about that. We have to understand that what we're storing up in our heart, how we're thinking about people, is going to come out in what we say. And we have to root in our heart this core idea that God gives us. Every single person, no matter their background, their skin color, their accent, their language, whatever it might be, they are made in the image of God. And that right there is the foundation for so much that we don't, need to know the rest. We can treat each other with respect and kindness and love simply because God made this person that's on the other side of the table.
I think it's the powerful part here in the middle of at the end of James 2:14 through 26, this idea of the works. And we talked about this in another podcast as well. But this is the whole point that is being made when we talk about faith and works, and why James does just a great job of bringing all of that together. Nobody's saying the idea that it's because of God's grace or not because of his grace. Of course, it's his grace. It's not us earning salvation. It's always going to be about his grace. But the reality is, if we're going to show or say that we have faith, we don't have to just say it. We can't just say it. It's going to be seen in the things that we do. And so the New American Standard, yours said evil thoughts. Mine says evil motives in the New American Standard. And I just reminds me so much of Proverbs, because they'll talk about God knowing the motive. God knows why we're doing the things that we're doing. And what James is helping us see is this is greater than this selfish perspective that we have so often. And it's the change from the selfish perspective into the godly perspective, using godly wisdom as he is in chapter 3. And that's exactly what Proverbs 6 is talking about. It's easy to be selfish. That's something we're really, really good at. The reality, though, for God's people is that we're striving to become this new person, this one that's a follower of Christ, acts like Christ, lives like Christ. And it's going to be seen in the way that we speak. It's going to be seen in the things that we do, not just simply by saying that we're a Christian, but actually showing that we're a Christian. We're Christ-like in our attitude. And that's why he'll use Abraham as an example, and he'll use Rahab here, because their works you see it. You see their faith, their willingness, their trust in God in these different situations here. And it's an application for us. We've got to make sure that the fruit or the works are showing truly what our heart, at least we're saying our heart is representing. And that's the fact that we are children of God. That's where we have to be so mindful of the things that we are doing, how we're treating other people, and understanding that it's going to be seen and people are going to know, and certainly God knows.
Yeah, that's the interesting part when the relationship with God is the starting point with me and God and how that's going to influence my own behavior, but also how I'm going to view and treat other people, how I'm going to use my tongue, which by its nature is usually when I'm interacting with other people. Um, it has to start with how I see myself and how I view God, and that's going to inform those other relationships. The idea here of faith and works, I mean, you can talk about, I believe in God. Do you believe God? Do you believe that he wants you to do these things? Is that belief in action, is how we would typically talk about faith. And I think that when you take this and you look at the examples he uses, like, just to be clear, we've got a really old patriarchal Jew who is like Hall of Fame top three, probably, for a lot of the Jewish readers, Jewish Christians that James would have been reading, and Abraham. Okay, obviously, Abraham's a great example of faith. And then Rahab, this Gentile prostitute, but also somebody who showed immense faith by how she treated the spies and what she did there in Joshua 2. And they're both held up on this equal standing because it's about the relationship with God. And while Abraham might have had a lot of more mileage at that point when he did the things that it talks about here compared to Rahab just starting her journey to make this really important decision at the Battle of Jericho, there's something to learn here. Again, going back to the idea of partiality, you hold Abraham and Rahab not knowing any of their story next to each other, and it's like, these two are nothing alike. What would they have in common? Well, they have everything in common because of faith in God. And for us, as James would teach, because we have this commonality in Jesus Christ. So I think it's worth reading here at the end, just looking at the wisdom that informs all this, right? He says a lot about the tongue that we could dig into, and we encourage you all to read this. He talks about it like a fire, like the rudder of a ship, like bits in the mouth of horses. It's the point that if you can get control of your tongue, you're doing pretty well. Like, if a man can control his tongue, he's perfect in all of his ways. Like, if you think you're doing well, let's assess how we're speaking, because that is the quickest way to fall, to sin, to stumble, and to be outside of the will of God, but it's also the quickest way to promote goodness and to seek the beauty of things that are in God's will and to encourage and promote truth. So it's a double-edged sword in that regard, but all of that comes down to how we're going to choose in our hearts to actually do those things. And so the last part of James 3 here, I think, is well worth ending on. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And that point about peace at the end, I think, is so relevant, whether we're talking about the partiality conversation, whether we're talking about how we're speaking, the faith and works. It's all about having peace with God and having peace with each other, having that relationship where no matter how different we are, we can have all things in common because of this peace that we receive through God in Jesus Christ. So hopefully this is insightful for you. Hopefully it gives you some things to think about as you go back and read through James 2 and James 3 and Proverbs chapter 6. We're going to finish James next time and look forward to talking about this war that goes on inside of us and the admonitions he gives for suffering and the difficulties that go on through life. It's all about the same idea, though, of living a wise life in Jesus Christ. And so if you have comments or questions, we encourage you to leave them down below this video. Be sure to like. We always appreciate that. Thumbs up. And we look forward to seeing you next time here on You Are From God.